There is a man sitting in a room right now. He has been sitting in that room for 11 years. And the most terrifying part, the part that will keep you up tonight, is not what was done to his body. It's what happened to his mind. Psychologists have a term for what happens when a human being is locked in total isolation long enough. They don't call it punishment. They don't call it rehabilitation. They call it, with clinical precision, psychiatric destruction. And here's what nobody tells you. The government knows. The neuroscience is settled. The studies are published. The UN has declared it torture. And yet, at this exact moment, over 80,000 people inside American prisons are living inside a concrete box the size of a parking space. For 22 hours a day, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. With the full knowledge and legal sanction of the state. What I'm about to show you is not a political argument. It is something far more unsettling than that. It is the documented step-by-step account of what happens to the human mind when you take away the one thing it cannot survive without, and why understanding it will permanently change the way you see yourself, your identity, and the invisible architecture that holds your sense of reality together. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will never think about silence the same way again. Before we go into the history, before we go into the neuroscience, I need to plant 3 ideas in your mind. 3 things you will understand by the end of this video that most people, including most psychologists, never fully reckon with the first. There was a group of scientists in the 1950s who paid ordinary university students to do nothing. No pain, no danger, just nothing. Comfortable rooms, good money, easy conditions. Every single one of them began to fall apart within hours. Not days, hours. And what they experienced, what they begged to make stop, was not boredom. The second, a man who spent almost 3 decades in solitary confinement was eventually released, exonerated, declared innocent by the courts. He walked out of prison a free man. And he could not walk in a straight line, not because of his legs. His legs were fine. His brain had physically restructured itself around the dimensions of his cell. Freedom, neurologically, had become more disorienting than captivity. The prison had moved inside him. The third, and this is the one I want you to hold on to, is a question that the entire field of psychology has been quietly circling for over a century. A question that solitary confinement accidentally, definitively answers. Who are you when there is no one left to see you? Because what isolation reveals in the most brutal possible way is that the self is not something you have. It is something you perform, together, with others, and without an audience, without the constant, invisible collaboration of other minds. It does not go quiet. It comes apart. That is what this video is about, and you will want to see where it ends. To understand why we put people in boxes and call it justice, you have to go back to 1829, Philadelphia, the Eastern State Penitentiary. The men who built it were Quakers, and they were, by the standards of their time, idealists. They looked at the prisons of the early 19th century, brutal, chaotic places full of violence and disease, and they believed there had to be a better way, a humane way. Their philosophy was deceptively simple. If a man could be left alone with his conscience, truly alone, he would be forced to reflect, to repent. The word penitentiary itself comes from penitence, the act of feeling sorrow for one's sins. The room wasn't meant to be a punishment. It was meant to be a crucible, a place where the soul would be broken down and reassembled into something moral, something restored. Every prisoner at Eastern State received a Bible. A small skylight, called the Eye of God, sat above each cell, casting a single shaft of light onto the floor. The guards wore wool socks over their shoes so that even footsteps couldn't be heard. The silence was total. The isolation was absolute. And the reformers who built this place were convinced they were doing something compassionate. Charles Dickens visited in 1842. He walked through those corridors and afterward wrote with a kind of quiet, controlled horror that the practice was cruel and wrong, that he had seen men whose minds had not been reformed, but unmade. Nobody listened. For nearly 2 centuries, the model spread. It evolved, it hardened. And today, solitary confinement is not an aberration in the American prison system. It is a standard administrative tool, used not just as punishment for violent infractions, but to manage mental illness, to protect vulnerable prisoners, to warehouse the inconvenient. It has become, in a very real sense, infrastructure. But here is what the Quakers did not know, and what we now do, is that the very instrument they designed to save the mind is, neuroscientifically speaking, one of the most effective tools ever created for destroying it. Let's talk about what the brain actually needs. There is a concept in neuroscience called social baseline theory, developed by psychologist James Cohen at the University of Virginia. The theory proposes something radical, that the human brain does not treat social connection as a preference. It treats it as a resource, as fundamental to its operating assumptions as oxygen or glucose. In study after study, Cohen found that the presence of another trusted human being literally reduces the brain's threat response. When you hold someone's hand, your amygdala quiets. Your prefrontal cortex expends less energy processing danger. The social bond is, neurologically speaking, a form of outsourced regulation. Other people aren't just nice to have around. They are part of the architecture your brain uses to stay calibrated. Now take that away entirely. When the external regulatory scaffolding collapses, the brain doesn't simply wait, it adapts. And the adaptations are catastrophic. The first thing to go is the prefrontal cortex's grip on reality. Without external stimulation, the brain doesn't enter a state of restful neutrality. It turns inward with a kind of frantic, undiscriminating hunger. It begins to generate its own input. Perceptions emerge without external cause. Shadows move. Voices form from the ambient hum of ventilation systems. The boundaries between thought and sound begin to dissolve. In the 1950s, a psychologist named Donald Hebb at McGill University paid university students to lie in a sensory deprivation chamber. Padded rooms, goggles, white noise. The students expected boredom. What they got was hallucinations. Within hours, not days, hours. Many refused to continue. Several reported what could only be described as acute, temporary psychosis. Now imagine that lasting not hours, but months, years. Psychiatrist Stuart Grassian spent decades interviewing prisoners held in solitary confinement, and what he documented was so consistent, so replicable, that it constitutes what he called a specific psychiatric syndrome unique to solitary confinement. The symptoms read like a clinical checklist for psychological disintegration: hypersensitivity to stimuli. The sound of a guard's footsteps becomes physically painful. A flickering light becomes unbearable. Perceptual distortions. Walls seem to breathe. Objects pulse. The cell expands and contracts. Cognitive fragmentation. Prisoners lose the ability to hold a coherent thought. Reading becomes impossible. Memory degrades. Time collapses into an undifferentiated fog. Paranoia, aggressive ideation, self-mutilation, and, at the furthest extreme, a phenomenon that Grassian described with unsettling precision as ego dissolution. The sense that the self itself is coming apart at the seams, that the person who walked into the cell is no longer the person still living in it. This is not metaphor. This is mechanism. The brain, deprived of the social input it is biologically structured to receive, begins to break down the very cognitive architecture that makes personhood possible. Numbers are easy to absorb and impossible to feel. So, let me give you a face. Robert King spent 29 years in solitary confinement in the Louisiana State Penitentiary, a place known as Angola, once called the most brutal prison in America. 29 years in a 6x9 cell. He was later exonerated, and in interviews after his release, he described something that stopped me the first time I read it. He said that after years of isolation, he no longer knew how to walk in a straight line. Not metaphorically, literally. His body had adapted so completely to the dimensions of his cell that walking through an open space felt disorienting, almost threatening. The freedom of an unenclosed room had become, neurologically, harder to navigate than captivity. His mind had physically reorganized itself around confinement. Terry Anderson, the American journalist held hostage in Lebanon for 7 years in near total isolation, wrote about the moment his inner monologue began to feel external. His own thoughts, emerging from his own mind, started to feel like they were coming from outside. The boundary between self and environment, the most fundamental psychological distinction a human being makes, had begun to erode. These are not weak men who succumb to adversity. These are people whose minds were subjected to conditions that the human nervous system is simply not built to survive intact. And this is the part that the architects of modern solitary confinement still do not want to reckon with. The damage is not a side effect. It is not an unfortunate complication. It is, based on everything we now know about how the brain functions, the predictable and inevitable outcome of what isolation does to a social organism. So, if the science is this clear, and it is, why does the practice persist? This is where psychology intersects with power. And it is, I'd argue, the most important question this conversation asks. The answer requires us to understand something called the fundamental attribution error, the deeply human tendency to attribute behavior to character rather than to context. We look at a person in a prison cell and we ask, what kind of person are they? We rarely ask, what kind of system put them there? And what is that system doing to them? Solitary confinement persists because it is politically convenient, because the language of punishment, of consequences, of isolation as deserved suffering, speaks to a moral intuition that is far older and far more visceral than neuroscience. It persists because the people inside those cells are, by social construction, people many of us have already decided we don't need to fully consider. And it persists because it works. Not as rehabilitation, but as management. It removes difficult people from the general population. It silences dissent within institutions. It is, in the language of prison administration, a tool for control. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture declared in 2015 that solitary confinement beyond 15 days constitutes cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. 15 days. The average stay in American solitary confinement is far longer. Some cases stretch to decades. The cognitive dissonance required to hold both we are a civilized society and we do this routinely is itself a masterclass in the kind of motivated reasoning that psychology has been documenting for 50 years. But here is where I want to take you somewhere deeper. Because this is not only a story about prisons, it is a story about identity itself. When Grassian's patients described ego dissolution, that terrifying sensation of the self coming apart, what were they actually experiencing? The philosopher George Herbert Mead argued in the early 20th century that the self is not a fixed internal object. It is a process. It is constructed, moment by moment, through interaction with other people. The I, the experiencing subject, requires the me, the reflected image of the self as seen through others' eyes, to remain coherent. Without social mirrors, the self loses its reference points. This is why isolation doesn't simply make people sad or anxious or bored. It unmakes them. The Eastern State Penitentiary's architects believed they were giving prisoners time alone with themselves. What they were actually doing, what we now know they were doing, is removing the very conditions that make a coherent self possible. And here is the philosophical rupture at the heart of all of this. Jean-Paul Sartre famously wrote, in No Exit, that hell is other people. The line has been quoted endlessly, usually by people who feel that society is exhausting, that relationships are a burden, that solitude is a form of freedom. But solitary confinement is the world's largest, most unambiguous laboratory for testing that claim. And what it tells us, what tens of thousands of broken minds tell us, is not that hell is other people. Hell is the absence of them. Let me bring you back to where we started. That room, 6 by 9, white walls, steel door. The eye of God letting in a single shaft of light. The Quakers who built it believed silence would produce reflection. What it produces instead is the systematic unraveling of the mind they hoped would do the reflecting. The cruelest irony of solitary confinement is this: the very faculty they sought to discipline, the human conscience, the capacity for moral self-examination, requires social contact to function. You cannot reflect without a self, and you cannot maintain a self without other people. What solitary confinement has proven, in the most brutal possible way, is that we are not individuals who occasionally need each other. We are, at our neurological core, constituted by each other. Our brains are built for contact. Our identities are assembled through relationship. Our sense of reality is regulated, moment to moment, by the presence of other minds. Take that away long enough, and what remains in the cell is not a person who has found themselves. It is a person who has lost themselves, slowly, systematically, in the silence we designed, justified, and continue to this day to call justice.